Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. We talk about all things vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that this show is something that you really look forward to listening in every single week. And we keep you in the know on the things that you need to accomplish in your yard and garden that week and month. Episodes drop every weekend on Apple Podcasts to get you ready for working in the yard on the weekend. So make sure you subscribe. Just look up the podcast app on Apple and search for Gardening Utah and hit subscribe, and that way you'll never miss an episode, and you can binge listen to past episodes if there's any that you've missed, or if you're just barely joining us for the first time. This is episode 22, so we've got quite a lot of amazing content that you can go back and listen to by topic. You can even just kind of look through all the different 22 episodes and pick and choose the ones that are most interest to you. We've got episodes on lawn care and all about trees and vegetable gardening, and you name it, we've talked about it. In fact, just a quick little note. It is peak harvest season right now for all of us vegetable gardeners. And I did a great episode on episode 20 all about really different recipes and ways that you can preserve your harvest. So if you're like me and you've got a kitchen filled with tomatoes and zucchini and squash that you're trying to figure out, what am I going to do with all of this? Well, I give some really interesting recipes and some tips and tricks in episode 20. So you can go back and have a listen to that if you are a vegetable gardener and you love to preserve your harvest. Okay, so let us know what you would like to see on Gardening Utah. And if you're not following us on Instagram, please head on over to Instagram. Give us look us up. We're at Gardening Utah. And you can always send us questions. I don't necessarily answer them during the week, but I read them, and then I can make sure that your question is answered in an upcoming show. I love to bring in experts and talk about the things that you're concerned about with your garden. So on today's show, this is going to be really exciting because it's all about fall. And honestly, I think in the spring, I love the spring so much because it's new and it's so exciting to be outside again. But there's something about fall when you're just so done with the summer heat and you've got that cool air, and just for some reason, I just love the fall. But there are a lot of garden tasks going on, and it is really, truly one of the most important times of the year to really do a lot of work now to prevent a lot of work later, and to really improve your garden for the next year to come. Everything from your shrubs to your trees to your lawn, and putting your vegetables to bed, if you will. There's a lot of tasks you got to do. So we're going to start today with a action-packed fall tips and tricks episode. And we're going to continue that over the next couple weeks and make sure that the Gardening Utah listener is in the know of all the things you need to do in your yard and garden for the fall to prevent pests next year, to have better growth on your trees and your shrubs and your lawn as well. And we're going to be talking about in future episodes, probably next week or the week after, we're going to talk about planting bulbs. So just stick with Gardening Utah, and we're going to keep you in the know of everything you need to do this fall. So today we have Liz Hamilton. She is a horticulturist, and if you are coming to Gardening Utah from the Utah Gardeners Facebook group, Liz is one of the amazing experts that gives of so much of her free time to answer a lot of the users' questions. And I'm so happy to have her here on this episode today. And I've got Cameron Allcott from Progressive Plants as well. So the three of us are going to really tackle your gardening questions. So we asked people in the Gardening Utah Facebook group to go ahead and just bombard us with their questions. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to tackle your fall gardening questions. And then again, in the next couple episodes, we're going to get really specific down to what you need to do with your lawn, what you need to do if you want to plant some bulbs, or if you have bulbs in the ground, but you want to make sure they have their best shot next year. So we're going to get into all of that in a minute. But first, the tip of the week.
860 KKAT, with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is don't throw out all of the dead leaves that accumulate in your yard. Now, as surely as the seasons change, autumn mornings, you'll be driving up and down the street and witnessing other homeowners bent over those triangular rusty tined rakes, and they're endlessly scraping all the withered foliage into tarps and onto heavy-duty garbage bags. And then you're seeing your streets lined with garbage bags filled with leaves. Now, leaf raking is an optional exercise. Okay, so listen, a thick layer of leaves should never be left to smother your grass growing beneath. Never. You always want to make sure that you handle the leaves on your lawn. But raking is not the only or even the easiest method to protect your lawn's health. You can mulch your leaves with your lawnmower. You mince them to literal shreds with your lawnmower and leave them on the grass. Now, I'm talking a thin layer, I'm not talking a thick layer, and compared to raking, mulching leaves is so much less work. So you're going to want to leave a thin layer of leaves on your lawn and mulch them with your lawnmower. And plenty of lawnmowers on the market right now have mulching capability. You can easily outfit a conventional non-mulching mower with a serrated blade designed for mulching leaves, and you can mulch them with any type of lawnmower, although it may take a few passes to do the job well. But no matter what type of lawnmower you own, you want to set the lawn mowing blade to its highest setting and remove the bag that protects the clippings. That's assuming you're going to spread these along your lawn. You're going to want to mow and shred these leaves into pieces that are about a 1/2 inch in diameter, which is more or less the size of a dime. So, as mentioned, depending on the volume of leaves that have fallen on your lawn, some people have, neighbor trees that are going like crazy and they've got piles. And some people like me, you've got kind of a thin layer as it is. Really easy to run over with the lawnmower a couple times and get them down to those dime size pieces. And so when you're done, the leaf shreds will just kind of fall between the blades of grass and they'll decompose and create great mulch and nutrients for your lawn over the coming year. Now, if you would like to put these leaves into the garden, you can do the exact same thing and just, rake them up. You could even put the bag on the lawnmower and have the leaves go into the bag and just keep shredding those and just layer those out into your garden, mix them in your garden beds or your raised beds. And that is a much better way to utilize these amazing leaves that fall that really are excellent nutrients for the soil. And that was the tip of the week.
Never miss a tip for your garden. Never miss a tip for your garden. And never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
All right, grab yourself a hot apple cider or a pumpkin spice latte because right after this quick break, we're going to be talking all about fall tips and tricks for your yard. We're going to have horticulturist Liz Hamilton and Cameron Allcott with Progressive Plants, and we're going to answer all the questions that you guys have sent in to us. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and we have a very special episode today. We have Cameron Allcott with Progressive Plants and Liz Hamilton, horticulturist, and they're with us to do a full episode on all of your questions regarding fall planting. So we have listeners in the Utah Gardeners group that are asking some questions right now that we are going to answer through this episode. And let's start really quick with something you posted the other day, Cameron. You had mentioned that fall is the perfect time to plant most things, especially in the ornamental and perennial space. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think one of the things that's kind of happened over the years is that the nursery business has taken advantage of the cabin fever that people have over winter and say, like, hey, why don't you come out and plant everything all in the spring? That's because that's when everybody wants to get out and start doing stuff.
True.
What I think that people don't really understand is that fall is one of the best times to actually plant most things. Now, not everything, just most, because what that does is that it gives you about 6 months of establishment time for the following year before the next summer hits. Because summer is actually one of the most stressful time for plants a lot of times, just because of the heat, the wind, lack of water, et cetera, et cetera. But when you plant in the fall, the roots are still continuing to grow. It's actually a really important time for plant root development, is because they're usually growing during the fall and the first part of winter month. And most root development occurs at temperatures above 36 degrees. So even in the winter, when the soil temperatures are still a little warmer, they'll still grow during that time. So that way it has enough of a root system to not have to fight so much with the heat the following spring. Because I see a lot of people, they plant everything in the spring, and then 3 weeks later it just gets so hot and so windy that they end up like losing their landscape. So they're just trying to baby stuff to keep them along.
We don't have much of a spring. So in other areas, like if people are used to gardening not in Utah's high desert, they have a month or 6 weeks of springtime where they're getting a good rain and they're getting cool temps, and it's an easy transition for plants. Whereas in Utah, as we all know, that especially this year, it was extreme. It was cold till it wasn't. It was hot till it wasn't. There's no downtime. And so for us in particular here in Utah, it's actually the fall, I think, is a more forgiving, easier time than the springtime, even though most nurseries, like in Cameron's business, they bring in now bring in springtime instead of in the fall, because that's when people are thinking about getting out of the house because they've had their cabin fever, as he puts it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And see, here at the nursery, where, we're like one of the only nurseries that actually do like their own production. We do most of our production for the following year. So in 2021, like we're planting that between like pretty much August up until like the middle of September. Like we're planting like 5,000 like 5-gallon Carl Forster grasses as we speak. So
what?
For sale, for sale in April. Yeah, my least favorite grass. But yeah, so I'll have those available in April, and I'm planting them now. So we don't have to do anything other than just stick them in a pot and let them sit.
We do have a question on Utah gardeners that relates to this. Emily Gunderson asks, is it too early or late to transplant raspberry starts?
Ooh.
And Emily, it's I would say it's actually a little early because we're still hitting 90 during the day. Waiting until the temps are a little bit cooler so that you're still getting root development once you plant, but you're not struggling to keep them and their tiny little baby roots watered heavily in high temps during the day is ideal. So next week we're in the 80s and slowly going down. And so next week anytime would probably be better than right away. And then they should be just fine. Just keep them a little moist through the wintertime because raspberries have shallower root systems, especially as they're getting established. And so if you wait and they kind of desiccate themselves and dry out over the wintertime, if you have a dry spate, it can take longer to come back in the spring. Or you could lose it if in an extreme case, if we have a ton of drought, but that's usually not the case. But I would put a little bit of water on it up until it gets much cooler or we have some rain or snow.
Interesting. One question I have there along those lines, I've heard with raspberries, you really probably, aside from transplanting it in your own yard, it's always best to buy them from a nursery, because if you're getting cuttings from a neighbor, you might be inviting disease. Is that a true understanding?
Yeah, and yes, that's true. And I would add to that, don't transplant from your own yard. And if you're buying from a nursery, make sure that nursery is using certified disease-free stock and that they're not dividing what they have and selling that off as well. Because I know that does occasionally happen. So raspberries are particularly prone to viral infections, particularly. And viral infections, while not super contagious in terms of like jumping from plant plant to plant and yard to yard. It does happen when you're dividing plants that are infected and moving them around the space. And so if you have like a nursery that has like, okay, I've got 20 raspberry plants and I'll split them all and then I'll have 40 for next year or whatever. Or if you're dividing your own and you have a disease and you're going to move it to another section of your yard or increase, you can be just transplanting that viral infection. For example, there's a virus called like fruit breaking virus that you get on raspberries, and what it causes is those drupes, the combined little baby fruits all together make your one big raspberry, right? And so it caused that fruit to fall apart and crumble. And so that breaking virus, the plants look healthy, they look big, everything looks fine, but your fruit is constantly falling apart. And people will say, oh, you're not getting enough water, or, oh, it's not enough sun, or, oh, it's this and that. And then you're transplanting that or dividing it all over your yard to find a better spot, and it's just diseased and you should have started over. So some viral infections just look like an abiotic issue, and they're not. It's viral. So even when your plants look healthy and things look fine, it may not be. And so just starting over is with disease-free certified stock from a reputable nursery is always going to be better for you.
Gotcha. That makes a ton of sense.
Hey, Liz.
Yeah.
You're really smart.
No, I'm not. I just absorb the information and regurgitate it. There's lots of people out there that can do that.
I was thinking the same thing as she was talking. I was like, wow, I'm so happy she's here because I wouldn't be able to do any of that. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I just read a question here. We are getting a ton of questions, by the way.
We are. There's so many.
Absolutely. We might need to do this much more often. So Brenda Smith-Ovison has asked, I have 3 trees that were basically stripped of their leaves during the hurricane, quote unquote, last week. She is at the base of the canyons in Centerville, so she was hit hard. She asks, will my trees be stressed from now until they go dormant for winter? What can she do to help them? The trees are 1 peach, 1 newly spring planted wireless Zelkova. Ooh, we love Zelkovas. And 1 spring planted
wireless. That's a hard one to find.
Really? And then she has 1 spring planted white flowering crab apple.
So the spring planted ones will be stressed and they don't love it. But there's really nothing you can do for them. Just keep water on them and sing to them. Probably would help. The ones that are established are going to be fine. They'll be fine. You don't want to give fertilizer right now as trees are going dormant because most fertilizer is going to stimulate new growth, and that's not what you want. Tender new growth is not what you want going into the fall. So just let it go dormant, give it some water, and cross your fingers. But I'm on the spring planted ones, but your established stuff will be just fine.
Yeah. The only thing that I would probably really caution about is not overwatering, because if the leaves were stripped off of these trees, they're not going to have the ability to shed excess water.
Right, they can't respirate.
They can't respirate. So sometimes you end up killing them with kindness when you're trying to help them. So honestly, I would tell you to not do really much of anything other than just let them do what they normally do, because trees are tough. I mean, you'd be really surprised what they can kind of put up with. So.
Well, and I'll just throw out a quick plug for last week's episode. I had Cameron here. We answered a lot of these types of questions because we really kind of focused on just trees and the things that you should and shouldn't do after this massive, storm that impacted so many of us. So, Brenda, if you haven't listened to last week's episode, which was episode 21 of Gardening Utah, head on back and maybe there's some other things that we could help you with as well. All right, Liz, what other questions are sticking out to you right now?
Well, I got one.
Go ahead.
Well, there's Susan Hall is asking, is hotboxing really worth it? And I'm not quite sure that I know what that means, but because when I was in college, hotboxing meant something completely different than anything. Well, it had to do with horticulture. But I'm just wondering if it's appropriate for this particular forum.
Well, I mean, yeah, I saw that question too and thought the same thing. That's actually the perfect question to lead into the break because we do have 1 minute left of this segment. Yeah, I thought, I think I do know what she means in the gardening space. So what do you think?
The only thing that I can really think of is just like if she's like, like running like a cold frame or something like that.
I think she just means putting a cold frame over a raised bed or maybe tarp.
Yeah.
Or not tarp, but black plastic. Is that what you think, Liz?
That's what I was thinking. I don't have any scientific information on that one.
Yes, Liz. Please share what you think about hotboxing.
I'm assuming she's either. Here's what I think she's meaning. I think she might mean either making your raised bed warmer. I'm just looking at Cameron here, and he's laughing so hard. So it's hard for me to not laugh. And then I was thinking, I almost said maybe she's talking about hotboxing the greenhouse, and that doesn't make sense either because that could be multi-dimensional.
I just asked her. I just responded and was like,
all right. So after this,
elaborate.
When we come back after this break, we're going to find out exactly what was meant with regard to hotboxing. And we'll be right back after this with Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
860 KKAT with Jana Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time. She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and with me here is horticulturist Liz Hamilton and Cameron Allcott from Progressive Plants. Guys, this has been fun so far.
Yes,
oh, yeah.
Good times.
So we are answering listeners' questions. We're getting a little bit more clarification on the question that we answered at the end of the last break. But meanwhile, we're going to get to a few topics that a lot of these questions have a very similar theme, and one of them is spider mites. So Jamie Hobbs is asking, is there anything I can do as I clean up my plants this fall to prevent spider mites next year? They were awful this year.
Oh boy. Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't think I've ever seen quite the year for spider mites.
Yeah, the spider mites prefer dry and dusty conditions. And this is one of the driest summers we've had on record. And super dusty. I mean, with the ash coming down and just the wind that we have had. I mean, remember how windy June was and how crazy? And then, of course, we had hurricane season last week, so that was nuts. But that picks up that dust and it drops it down onto your plants. And so between dry, dusty, hot, it has been like a booming year for spider mites. I've seen them in places I've never seen them before.
I have seen them on a lot of things. And weeping white spruce specifically have been really bad. And then a lot on burning bush this year.
Yeah, raspberries. We talked about raspberries earlier, but raspberries have just been getting decimated. And roses. I had a whole rose I had to trim literally to the ground and take every leaf off of it because the infestation was so bad I didn't think it would recover if I left the leaves on it. So in terms of doing stuff to prevent spider mites for next year, horticultural dormant oil is going to be the best thing that you can do to prevent stuff because as its name implies, you wait till the leaves fall off and then you're going to spray that plant, making sure to get all the branches and then the trunk really, really well. And what that does is it comes in and it coats into every little nook and cranny, and then it gets into those like leaf scars and bud scales that are getting ready to pop for next year, as that is where spider mites hibernate and overwinter either as adults themselves or as their eggs. And so a dormant oil spray in late winter after the plant has lost all of its leaves, like in end of November, early December is good. And then the next treatment, usually in early March, just to really knock anything out that you might have missed in the late winter or early winter is going to be ideal. And that way you get 2 treatments in before anything pops up.
Hey, Liz, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you need to keep anything different in mind if you're spraying conifers? Because I know that sometimes with a lot of different sprays, they can be phytotoxic. Do we need to be concerned about that with dormant oil as well?
So I would just make sure that the dormant oil that you use is rated for evergreens if you have evergreens to spray, because there are some that are like a 2% dormant oil and they're super viscous and it will coat that leaf. And if you have like an evergreen waxy leaf, it's going to end up suffocating the stoma that are in there that the plant uses to breathe, and then it'll drop its needles, drop its leaves, and die, which isn't what you want, or severely stunt the plant. So making sure, but you can use a lighter oil, like a light horticultural oil, because some are rated for summer use, but that you can also use in the wintertime, or it'll say all season dormant oil or all season horticultural oil on it instead of dormant oil on the label. And you can use that as a dormant oil, and most of those are rated for conifers. So just making sure that you have one that lists a plant specifically is going to be ideal.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I want to remind, like pretty much like all of your listeners, is make sure you always read the labels for the plants, because I notice a lot of different types of chemicals that have different purposes are toxic to certain types of plants. Like for instance, like different pre-emergents are good for different type of situations. Because I've got issues where, like, so sometimes I have to use a pre-emergent for like honeysuckles, but I can't use them with hydrangeas and vice versa. So make sure that you are always reading the labels, and because they'll usually list some sort of degree of phytotoxicity between them.
Right, and that includes anything organic. I mean, dormant oil and horticultural oil are both organic, but they will strip your plants and kill them if you use them in the wrong application. And then, and to tag onto that question, Carolyn Davis asked, I had a horrible aphid issue this year. Is there something I can do to avoid those? And it was under the spider mite question. Dormant oil will also knock out aphid populations because they also overwinter their larvae and their eggs in leaf scale and bud scale. And so spraying early on with a dormant oil is going to be really good for plants that had aphid issues as well as spider mites.
Courtney Shore is saying, what things being pulled out of the garden box at the end of the season can be composted and what shouldn't be?
That's being pulled out of the garden box. So anything that was sick should probably not be composted. If you know what it was sick with, then that might be a little bit different, but I wouldn't compost it. Anything that wasn't really having an issue, you can go ahead and compost that, because most like insect and fungal issues will die in a composting situation. Bacteria depends. And so, like for instance, if you know you have bacterial black spot on your tomato plants, I would not compost that. But if you had powdery mildew on your squash, you could compost that if you know that your compost is getting up to the right degree to burn that powdery mildew away. And the caveat there is that most people don't get it hot enough.
Yep.
So if you know you had disease and you know that you're not really like managing your compost super great, then maybe that's not something you want to add. But if you know you're going to keep that compost really hot and you're going to turn it regularly, then go ahead and compost all of that. Things that were insect infested are probably fine to compost, again, if you know that your compost is going to get hot. For example, spider mites tend to, if they're not going to overwinter in your leaf buds and your leaf scale, and you have a different variety of spider mites like tomato russet mite, they actually overwinter in soil. They wait for those leaves to fall off the plants because it's an annual, and they're going to overwinter in the soil, and then you plant tomatoes in that or anything else in that spot again next year, then you're going to end up with infested plants again, because they're just going to crawl out of the soil and get all over everything. So if you're going to go ahead and compost something like that, and maybe you had spider mites, if you're going to get up hot enough, go ahead and compost it. If you're concerned and you're not really following that composter, maybe that's something you ought to just chuck. So just kind of being aware of issues your garden may have faced this spring and summer is going to tell you what you can and can't compost this fall. But generally speaking, everything should and could be composted as long as it's disease-free and you're bringing up your compost to the accurate temperature that it needs to really burn it down.
Very good tips. So we'll be right back with more of your questions, particularly around composting, right after this. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT with more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, with Cameron Allcott from Progressive Plants and horticulturist Liz Hamilton answering your fall gardening questions today. We're talking composting right now. That seems to be a big theme of questions in the group today. And Paulette is asking, she says, I just started a compost bin and I'm going to have tons of leaves to rake. Should I add them all or pile them somewhere in the yard where I can add them as I add kitchen scraps? I'm trying to get a balance of browns and greens. And then we also have a question from Jennifer that kind of segues that says, what should I add to my leaf mulch to help it break it down over the winter?
So what you want when you're starting at the compost pile is a ratio of 2-to-1 greens to browns. So 2 greens to every 1 brown. And if you have a ton of leaf mulch or leaves, which are considered browns, and not that much green, you're going to end up with the incorrect ratio to get your compost as hot as you need it, so that everything breaks down correctly. So what you can do, and I'll also say, not just, it's going to be easier on you if you don't just rake your leaves into a pile, you should shred them. So like rake them into a windrow and then run them over with the bagging mower if you have access to a bagging mower, and then take those and add that to your compost pile instead of just piling complete leaves on there. Shredded leaves are always better and they break down faster. And then collect your greens, and then if you have a pile of browns, add those back in as you add more greens to your compost pile. So have your designated compost pile, you're adding greens, and then add that. So for every 2 of greens, you add 1 scoop of browns or whatever, if that answers the question. And then for that, in terms of what can you add to your leaf mulch to help it break down over the winter, which was Jennifer Briggs' question, which is, what should I add to my leaf mulch to help it break down over the winter? And her question is, do I use blood meal? And so what you can use is any form of nitrogen, which blood meal is. Blood meal is an organic form of nitrogen, and that works. But typically what a lot of people will use is urea, so unpelleted nitrogen, which is usually like a 4600 if you buy that at the store. And nitrogen is super hot, and so you can fold that like immediate and see like an instantaneous heat. Like often you can see that smoking and steaming right away when you add urea. So blood meal is a good one, but it's going to be a slow burn and it's going to take a little bit to convert into nitrogen. Urea is going to be working on contact, and so that's another option. And it's just nitrogen. There's nothing else in it. And make sure you're buying unpelleted urea and not anything that's pelleted, because then it's going to take a while to break down, and unpelleted is going to be instant use on that. Gotcha. And then somebody else also asked, is it better to add compost now or in the spring? Oh, that's Kayleen Anderson Whitelock.
Yeah.
Is it better to add compost now or in the spring? And I assume she's asking about the garden.
Yeah.
And you should add compost anytime. If your compost isn't super broken down, if it's still kind of working on it, now is good, because then it can sit in that fall garden all winter long and break down even further. If it's broken down really well now, you can add it now or in the spring, either one. And then somebody else asked, what organic items can I till into my garden? Yeah. And is it better to till in the fall or the spring? So that was Brianna and Bailey asked those 2 questions in conjunction. And organic items that you can till into your garden are things like the blood meal that we just mentioned, bone meal is good, and then compost. Animal manure is good now because it takes the fall to break down and then it's ready to go by the time you get done in the spring, or get ready to get going in the spring. And then Bailey asked, is it better to till in the fall or the spring? And it sort of depends on your garden. I would say if you're going to till, because you also hear about no-till, but if you're planning on tilling, I think once of each is best. So at the end of the season and then again in the spring. And I say that because tilling is good for controlling insects. And so if you had squash bugs, if you had aphids, if you had spider mites, turning that soil over and exposing it, if you have cutworms and armyworms that are nesting in the soil, things like that, turning that soil over, exposing that to sunlight, and then tilling that under and slowly destroying that population is what tilling is extra good for. And that's why they use it usually in commercial enterprises and stuff, because you're lowering your pest load when you're tilling. But again, that also applies to your beneficial insects as well. So you're tilling those under too. So something to think about. It's give and take there.
I've always wondered that. Well, because I listen to so many gardening podcasts, and a lot of them, especially ones in the UK, are talking so much about no-till, just add to your soil. And I've been really struggling with this lately.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some merit to both ideas. And, the science behind the studies in that, like, should I till my garden or should I not? You can have great results with both, but the science behind it kind of says it depends. It depends on when you're tilling and what you're tilling and why you're tilling. And tilling can be really good for some things, like if you're growing a carrot patch and you're starting with really compacted soil. If you have soil that's really rocky or really clayey, tilling in things that are going to help break that down and flocculate that soil or break those molecules down are going to be, better than just trying to layer stuff on the surface and hope that works. And so, there's mixed reviews out there, but the science says, yeah, it's great in some things and it's better to try and till in others. And for me, as somebody who ran 2 demonstration gardens that were side by side, I ran a conventional garden, edible garden, and a no-till all organic garden. And they were kind of, and of course you can't be certified organic because I was too close to the conventional garden, but they were managed differently. And so for me, I would say in the conventional garden, I had much lower pest loads. And I think that's because I tilled everything under and got rid of them. And got rid of much of them. And in the no-till garden, I had higher pest loads, but which was more difficult to deal with because it was an organic space. But it was cooler. It wasn't as hot. And so the plants seemed healthy, even though maybe they had some pest issues. And so, working in it was easier because I wasn't exhausted and hot all the time and things like that. So there were some benefits. I mean, you could walk from the conventional garden across, the 10-foot barrier that we had in between them and end up in that no-till, and it was significantly degrees cooler.
Wow.
I mean, just from going from one to the other, because the other one had more, I think, like residual humidity coming from the bark decomposing and the water retention that it had that I wasn't getting in the conventional side. So, I mean, either one is going to be, it sort of depends on your style and what's going to work for you and what works in your space and what your soil is. So there's not one really right answer there. But if you're going to till in the fall until again, and then let it sit all exposed. So don't till it and then make it like rake it all down and make it look beautiful. Till it and leave it tilled up, and then rake it down, knock it down, till it and make it look beautiful in the springtime.
Aha. Oh, that's a fantastic tip. Okay. I got it.
Hey, so I got an answer to what hotboxing is.
Oh, you did? Here we go. Let's hear it.
So Susan writes, evidently people are putting tarps, their pulled beds, planting boxes, and the heat will kill the bugs in the soil like grubs and whatever. So I think she's kind of talking about like solarization.
Oh, solarization.
Yeah, which I know we normally do for like weeds and stuff like that. So that's what she means by hotboxing, not the giving it the old college try. Yeah. And I don't know how you feel about this, Liz, but I've never really been a big fan of like solarization, or I know that there's like, people are trying to be more organic, use like less chemicals, but it seems like a lot of these methods are actually more detrimental to soil health than just, isolating and doing like a spot treatment for something, if that kind of makes sense. Because when you generate that much heat, you kind of kill some of your bugs, but you're also killing all of the beneficial flora, all of the microorganisms that your plants will use in order to
heat is
healthy.
Heat is an organic indiscriminate killer.
Yes.
To put it that way.
Like Ted Bundy.
So, okay, just like him. Heat is an indiscriminate killer, and so two thoughts on that. If you're solarizing now, no, it's not worth it, because we're headed into the cool season and you need hot temperatures in the summer to do that. And so, no, now it's not going to be worth it, and it's not going to be effective. And if you're talking about just in general, to maybe use next spring going into the summer, it's only effective in the top, I think in the studies they did, it's like 3 to 5 inches of soil. And so if you have deep-rooted perennial weeds like, the dreaded common bindweed, if you have white top, if you have Bermuda grass, quackgrass, those weeds are just going to laugh in the face of your solarization, and they will be right back, and you've done nothing to get rid of them. If your only issue is shallow-rooted annual weeds like chickweed and Veronica, speedwell, and things like that, and you're just trying to get rid of that heavy seed load, then it's effective, but and it would work. I think the things to consider is that it takes a while. It's not instantaneous. You got to leave it up for a month or two. And if you're trying to plant also in the spring, you're eating into your planting time. And by the time the solarization has gotten around to working, you're looking at midsummer, which is not an ideal time for planting. And it's not attractive to look at while you're doing it. And then it's also, kind of labor intensive to put down, I think, and then take back up. And again, like you mentioned, you're killing all of the good in the top 5 inches of soil as well as the bad. You're killing your seed load, but you've killed any worms, you've killed any microorganisms, you've killed any, fungal, abiotic, things like that. You've kind of gotten rid of all of those other issues as well, which might be what you want if you have things like, cutworms and stuff in your grass, but.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, we only have 30 seconds left of this episode, and I can't even believe it's gone so fast. But we have a question from Barbara, and she asks, what to cut down to the ground? Mums, daylilies, ornamental grasses? That's a big question. We might need to answer some after the show, but give them the nuts and bolts, Cameron.
I would say go ahead and cut all of those things down after they have been frost damaged enough and are no longer actively growing. So probably November-ish.
Awesome. So if you're listening to this on the radio, you can download this episode on Apple Podcasts. It is episode 22 of Gardening Utah, and you will hear more of our conversation on that episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for being here, you guys.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, that's all for today's episode of Gardening Utah. Thank you so much to Liz and Cameron for joining me again. I'm telling you, Liz is such a genius. And look, she was also on episode 9 of Gardening Utah, so you can go on back and have a listen to her on that episode as well. And if you're listening to this on KKAT Radio, you can go to Gardening Utah on Apple Podcast and listen to more from Cameron and Liz just by searching episode 22. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Shout out to our producer, Lambo. I'm Jana Francis. See you next week here on Gardening Utah. And remember, grow big or go home.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.
All right, Gardening Utah podcast listeners, you're in for a treat. This next section is going to be a portion of next week's episode, but you heard it here first. We wanted to include this in this week's podcast episode because so many of you asked questions on the Gardening Utah Facebook group, and we wanted you to get your answers as soon as possible. So this last segment is not airing on the radio for another week, but you get the little sneak peek so we can get your fall garden questions answered. So have a listen to this, as well as toward the end, we randomly start talking a little bit about our own composting habits. We're kind of having like a more of a personal conversation, and I figured I'd include that in the podcast, but it's because it's kind of fun to get to know us a little bit better. We talk about our personal composting habits. We talk a little bit about rodents and pests in our yard and things like that. So enjoy, have a listen, and go ahead and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, because I know if you're listening on Apple Podcasts right now. So just go and give us 5 stars. We'd love it if you'd leave a review. In fact, I'll give you a shout out on the next episode. But if you don't, that's okay. Just hit the 5-star button, and that will help us out a lot. All right. Off to Cameron and Liz and more of Gardening Utah. Thanks for listening. Enjoy.
Kind of talked about it earlier, kind of like off the air. I mean, like generally speaking, if it's an herbaceous stemmed plant, typically I myself will cut those down once they have frozen hard enough and they're no longer actively growing. I typically like to cut things down. Generally speaking, if it's a woody stemmed plant, I do not touch it until spring, unless it blooms off of old wood. Then I will prune it after it blooms.
Gotcha.
So sometimes I'm doing like some spot pruning and stuff like that into like June and sometimes even July, depending on what it is. But yeah, like I said, like perennials, most grasses, like once we freeze, like go ahead and mow them down.
Yeah.
That's totally fine.
Yeah. Okay, so there's 2 questions here. Chris Ty says, anything I can do this fall to leaf hoppers?
And I answered her. I texted back because I wasn't sure if we'd get to it.
Okay.
It would help. But leafhoppers are kind of tricky because they fly around and do all that kind of stuff. So spraying in the affected area if she's an organic gardener and she wants organic solutions, so spraying in that area with dormant oil and neem oil now, dormant oil in the fall, like after everything's gone to bed, will also help. Neem oil isn't an immediate effect. What neem oil does is it affects an insect's ability to have a sex drive. And so if you spray neem oil regularly, like early on in the spring as nymphs are emerging, and you're spraying pretty consistently with that neem, as that insect molts, because they can't reproduce sexually until they are in their final adult molt. But every time it gets hit or it feeds on something with neem, it slowly decreases that insect's sex drive instincts. And so by the time it goes into its final molt, it's not interested in reproducing. And when you have an insect like a leafhopper that is univolt or multivoltine, and that means has multiple life cycles over the course of a season. So leafhopper is going to have 3 to 4 life cycles in which they're mating and reproducing and dying, and mating and reproducing, laying eggs and dying. Over the summer, spraying neem oil regularly, where you may not see an immediate result. Like you're not going to see dead leaf hoppers all over the ground when you come back to that. But you will see over time decreased insect feeding activity, and so that's what you're going for over time. And so she also asks if cutting everything down and disposing would help, and yes, it would. Just because they're going to be getting rid of any, egg material and things like that. So it doesn't hurt.
Well, and that's so interesting you just said that, because the very next question from Janelle is almost a very interesting segue, where she says, I'm always afraid to cut everything back in the fall because I don't want to accidentally get rid of any beneficial insect eggs for next year. So I do love a freshly clean and mulched yard in the fall. I'm so conflicted. What is best?
That's a hard one.
Yeah.
It's going to be what it's It's really kind of up to you. I would say it's really mostly personal preference.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so they've done a ton of studies that agree that going out and doing massive yard cleanup is detrimental to overwintering beneficials like butterflies and things like that. And so, praying mantis eggs, all those things, ladybug larvae that are overwintering. So it's just it's going to be what's important to you. Do you want to have a clean and freshly mulched yard, or are you, really trying for butterfly conservation and things like that? And if, the answer is yes to butterfly conservation, having a clean and freshly mulched yard is really not going to do it.
Yeah.
If you are more concerned about having that clean look, then know that when you do that fall cleanup, you're probably sacrificing, butterfly larvae and beneficial insects. But I mean, the flip side to that is garden cleanup also gets rid of, just like we talked about tilling, non-beneficial insect hidovers too, like squash bugs. I mean, we've seen even posts on, the Utah Gardeners Facebook page where people have said, oh my gosh, it's January and I went out and raked up some of this stuff that fell down and adult squash bugs crawled out of it. And that's how they overwinter. Adult squash bugs find each other. They nest just like a box elder bug. They're all in the same families, right? They find a warm spot and they kind of cohabitate through the winter time, trying to stay warm. And then they emerge in the spring when it gets warm, and they mate and lay eggs, and they die after that, after they overwinter. And that's the first, set of squash bugs that come out. And so if you leave that plant matter out, you've left space for those overwintering bad bugs too. And so it's a give and take. You want the good bugs, you also get the bad bugs with it, and there's really no way to discriminate.
Yeah.
If you don't want any of it, clean up your yard and mulch it and make it look beautiful. It just sort of depends.
Yeah.
Shannon asks about roses.
Okay, let's do that.
You want to talk about that, Cameron?
The pruning them?
Yes.
I just look at roses and I just wholesale slaughter them in the spring. No, like most roses, like your shrub roses, like floribundas, grandifolias. I usually just cut those back to somewhere between 6 to 12 inches, depending on the rose. Usually around the first 2 weeks of March, right as they're starting to wake up a little bit. Sometimes even at the end of February, just depending on what the season's doing. But and then I just cut it back hard and then just let them go. And that's all that you really have to do. I've noticed over the years that roses seem to struggle a little bit more if you cut them in the fall, especially if you have some of the more tender zone 5 ones. I've never really understood the mechanics of why, but it's just something that we've just kind of noticed over the years. My mom loves roses, and so she made me prune them a lot for her. And then when I did it at the wrong time of year, they died, and she got mad at me, and then she grounded me and was like, hey, you have to go work at the nursery now. And I'm like, dang it. So,
is that how you ended up there?
No, I ended up here because I got bad grades, and they thought that the value of hard work would, teach me a lesson. So,
got it.
But anyway, roses to me are one of the easiest maintenance plants out there. I know some people don't like it because of the thorns, or they think they have to deadhead, or just do all these things. And the reality of it is that almost everything that's been bred currently is so easy to take care of. And in my opinion, there's no other plant that gives you that much floral color through the course of a year, because they bloom almost constantly below 95 degrees. Most of them are really very good about that. So, I just prune them hard and then just let them go. And then our growing season usually limits how big they'll actually really get. Things.
My Dallas and I, when we were dating and first lived together, long before we got married and had kids, we had a huge garden and we had a monster compost heap, and we did really well with it. It was killer, and it was really beautiful by the end of the year, beautiful dirt. but we've never had one since. Like we didn't have one when we bought our first house. We didn't have one there, and we've not. I mean, it's been like 10 years. So
yeah, I think the key for me when I've had the best compost piles is when I have fresh access to like manure from horses or chickens. Like now I obviously do, and so it heats up, the pine shavings that I use in the coop. That's like the perfect mixture to chuck in your compost and get it heated up. And my uncle lives only 2 houses down, and he's got, all the stall shavings, and that pile is steaming all winter long, Yeah. But we'll go and siphon off some of that, but that's when it's worked best for me because I'm not like Mrs. Compost, but I mean, like, yeah, but I compost everything though. I mean, everything you can compost. I'm like so particular. Like I will go out of my way to like take a tomato that somebody in the dinner plate left on their dinner plate to like throw in the compost. I'm weird like that. A little too much, but it's okay.
Yeah. I mean, some people are avidly into it, and you can have it can give back. And I wouldn't be opposed to doing one here in Sandy, except that truly like the neighborhood rat problem is a massive issue. And I don't want to have anything to do with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So far I've been lucky I don't have any rodents in it, but there's also like 3 roaming outdoor cats that are nonstop passing through and taking care of a lot of that. But like I went so far as to, when I built my house, how sometimes you've got the built-in garbage bins into the cabinetry. So I went so far as to put a cutting board on top of that in a different drawer that, so I have a double, it's like a garbage bin and then a compost bin. And on top I've got, the cutting board, and the cutting board has a hole, just a small hole in the back that dumps right into my compost heap when I'm cutting vegetables and stuff. So it's just like, it's kind of fun. Anyway.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have rats. I caught the biggest one like last week.
Oh no.
It was so loud. I was shoveling rock out front because, we just redid our backyard. And the trap snapped, and that thing was like screaming. And it was like 12 feet from me. Like that rat was just chilling like 12 feet from me.
Oh man.
Yeah, we found a couple of dead ones in Mandy's yard last year.
I guess Sandy had such a bad problem 2 years ago that the city sent out notices and was like, if you see rats during the daytime, you should assume there's 20 more and that you're infested, and you should call the city exterminator.
Wow.
It's like roaches.
And gross.
Yikes. Yeah, so far I've been lucky, but I'm surprised though because I live right on the river, and usually that's a bad combination. But so
you probably have them.
I know I do for sure. I just haven't seen it.
Oh yeah, mine are like my next door neighbor. He's like, his wife, she said she was doing, this is my literal next door neighbor, like we share a fence, and he said his wife was doing dishes last week, and she watched him run back and forth across the fence line while she was standing at her window doing dishes.
Oh no.
Yeah, pretty gross. And then my husband and I, we were sitting taking a lunch break after working in the yard all day, like in the backyard again, because our yard's not huge. And we sat down to take a water break, and we were sitting at the table in the backyard and watched one like crawl out of my vegetable bed and like run around in the yard. We were like, well, that was disgusting.
Oh my word. Oh my word.
And then I put that trap out and caught one like 12 foot from me, like that's gross.
Oh my gosh. On Saturday I was going to this gardening fair that we had a booth at, and when I was pulling out of the driveway, I looked to the left and I noticed that a big chunk of my grass in my front yard was torn to bits. And I'm like, what in the world happened overnight? Because we had just mowed the day before. And I put my car in park. I get out and I look over it, and there's these little holes all over my grass and just torn everywhere. And then my neighbor had mentioned He has it on video camera. All of security cameras picked it up. A family of raccoons and a big skunk in a big group were just like toddling around the hood, and they were tearing our grass apart looking for grubs.
Yeah, looking for grubs.
Uh-huh. Man, oh man, yeah, it did a number on my front yard. Not good at all. All right, thanks so much for listening, everybody. That was just a little bit of additional questions, as well as just us talking while we're recording our show. Sometimes I realize that some of the side conversations we have are just as informative and as interesting as the specified topics of the show. And quite often when you're just talking and you're not specifically recording, you get some good content that is just a little bit of a different delivery. So hope you enjoyed that episode. We'll see you next week here on Gardening Utah. Again, give us a little 5-star since you're here listening on Apple Podcasts. Make sure to subscribe, and can't wait to see you next week for episode 23 right here on Gardening Utah. Bye-bye.
Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.